My name is Claire Whitfield. I'm 33 years old, and I've spent the last 6 years pulling gunshot victims and car crash survivors back from the edge of death as a Level 1 trauma surgeon at Charleston Regional Medical Center. That night, standing in a ballroom overlooking the Ashley River in a navy cocktail dress, my future father-in-law shook my hand, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "So, sweetheart, my son tells me you're a nurse. That's a lovely, stable profession for a wife." I smiled. I said something like that, and I let the lie live for exactly 1 more hour because I hadn't decided yet whether I was going to burn it down. Welcome back to Quiet Storm Family Stories. If you've ever been shrunk down to fit someone else's idea of you, stay with me, because this one's about to turn. Drop a comment if you've ever smiled through a room that didn't know who you actually were. Let me back up. I'd driven up from Charleston to Savannah that afternoon for my fiancé Grant's family rehearsal dinner. Not our wedding, his sister Paige's. Grant's family had insisted I come properly introduced before the big day next spring, since his father, Dr. Richard Voss, was flying in from Houston. Richard Voss wasn't just any father-in-law, he was chief of cardiothoracic surgery at Baylor St. Luke's. The kind of man who got quoted in medical journals and had a wing of a hospital named half after him. Grant had warned me on the phone 3 days earlier. Dad's old school. He doesn't love the idea of 2 doctors in one marriage competing for attention. Just let me handle how I introduce you tonight, okay? I should have asked what that meant. I didn't. I was tired. I'd just come off a 26-hour trauma call, and I wanted, for once, to just show up and be someone's fiancé, instead of the surgeon who tells families their son isn't coming home. So I said okay. The venue was a restored cotton warehouse on the river, exposed brick string lights, the kind of place that costs more per hour than my first year's rent. Grant's mother, Deborah, greeted me with a hug that didn't quite reach her eyes and a whispered, "You look so put together for someone in your line of work." I filed that away. I've learned to file things away. It's a skill you build fast in a trauma bay. Notice everything, react to nothing, not yet. Grant found me by the bar, kissed my cheek, and steered me by the elbow toward a cluster of his father's colleagues. "This is Claire," he said. "She's in healthcare, works with patients. 6 years of residency, 2 fellowships, 400 documented trauma cases." And Grant had reduced it to a sentence you'd use for a hospice volunteer. I opened my mouth. He squeezed my hand under the table before I'd even sat down. "Not now," his eyes said. "Please. I'm going to tell you exactly what the arithmetic felt like in that moment, because if you've ever done it, you already know. It's not anger, not at first, it's math. You start counting. Every skipped call I answered anyway during his family's holidays. Every 3 a.m. shift I covered so I could make it to his cousin's christening. Every time I introduced Grant to my colleagues as a rising star, full name, full title, no shrinking. And here I was, sitting at a table with a napkin folded in my lap, being introduced as someone who works with patients, like I changed IV bags for a living. I wasn't angry that they didn't know. I was angry that they'd decided without asking me exactly how much of me was allowed in the room. Dinner started. Dr. Voss held court from the head of the table, the way men like that always do, without ever raising his voice, because he's never had to. He talked about a valve replacement he'd done that morning before his flight. Casual. The way other people talk about traffic. Deborah beamed at him like he'd personally invented the human heart. Paige's fiancé nodded along, saying, "Wow, in all the right places." Then Dr. Voss turned to me. "So, Claire, Grant tells me you work with patients. What's your specialty? Outpatient? Admin?" The table went quiet enough that I could hear the ice shift in my glass. I looked at Grant. He was studying his bread plate like it held the secrets of the universe. I could have let it go. I'd let it go for 4 hours already. But something about the word admin, clean, safe, small, landed different than I expected. I thought about the boy I'd coded for 11 minutes on Tuesday, until his heart caught its own rhythm again. I thought about the family I'd walked out to at 4 a.m. to tell them their daughter made it. I thought about every version of Claire that Grant had decided was easier to explain than the real one. "I'm a trauma surgeon," I said. Flat, even. No apology in it. Level 1 center, Charleston Regional. The words landed on that white tablecloth like a dropped glass, and for 1 second, nobody at that table moved. if you've ever had your own family redefine you into something smaller, because the truth felt inconvenient. I want you to sit with me for the next part, because it's about to get a lot more interesting. Dr. Voss set down his wine glass very slowly, and for the first time all evening, he actually looked at me. Really looked. Like he was seeing a different person than the one he'd been talking to for the last 2 hours. And somewhere behind those calm surgeon's eyes, I watched him start doing his own arithmetic. Trauma surgeon, he repeated, like he was testing the weight of the words in his own mouth. Level 1, he glanced at Grant. Grant still hadn't looked up from his plate. Deborah's smile had gone thin and brittle at the edges, the kind of smile that's trying to hold a room together with nothing but muscle memory. I hadn't planned this. I want to be clear about that, because people ask me later if I'd staged it, if I'd been waiting all night for the perfect moment to detonate. I hadn't. I'd been ready to swallow it, the way I'd swallowed it for 4 hours, the way I'd swallowed it for the 2 years Grant and I had been together. But somewhere between admin and the memory of that boy's heartbeat, catching under my hands, I decided I was done editing myself, down to a size that made other people comfortable. Dr. Voss reached for his phone, and I watched him do exactly what I do every single day in a trauma bay: assess, verify, act. He wasn't being rude. He was doing what men like him do when the data doesn't match the story they'd been given. And across the table, Grant finally looked up, and for the first time all night, I watched real fear cross his face. Not fear of his father, but fear of what I might say next, now that I'd started. Let me tell you a little more about how I got here, because the woman sitting at that table in a rented ballroom didn't happen by accident. I grew up in a 2-bedroom house outside Columbia, South Carolina, the oldest of 3, with a mother who cleaned offices at night, and a father who drove a delivery route 6 days a week. Nobody in my family had ever been to medical school. Nobody understood, when I came home at 17 and said I wanted to be a surgeon, that it wasn't a phase. It was the only thing that had ever made sense to me. The idea that with steady hands and the right training, you could stop someone from dying, who was supposed to die that day. I paid my own way through undergrad working nights at a diner off I-26, slept 4 hours a night through most of medical school, and matched into a general surgery residency that broke people twice as tough as me. Trauma surgery isn't glamorous. It's 26-hour shifts. It's holding pressure on a wound with your bare hands while someone screams. It's learning to make split-second decisions that either save a life or don't, and living with either outcome by morning rounds. I built that career one broken night at a time, with nobody's help, and I never once needed anyone at a dinner table to validate it. Until Grant sat there and let his father call me admin. That's the part that still catches in my throat when I think about it. Not that Dr. Voss didn't know. Strangers don't know things about you until you tell them. What I couldn't get past was that Grant knew exactly what I was, had watched me stitch myself back together after a 19-hour shift, more times than I could count, had let me cry in his car after losing a 7-year-old on the table, and he still decided, without asking me, that the truth of who I was would be inconvenient at his father's table. If you've ever loved someone who was fine with your success in private, but couldn't stand behind it in public, tell me in the comments. Because that particular kind of loneliness has a very specific shape, and once you've felt it, you never forget it. Dr. Voss looked up from his phone. He hadn't said a word in almost a full minute, and at a table full of surgeons and their spouses, a full minute of silence from the man who usually ran the room felt like a held breath before a code call. He set the phone face down on the tablecloth, folded his hands, and looked at me the way he probably looked at an MRI before deciding whether to open someone's chest. Charleston Regional doesn't have many trauma surgeons under 35, he said slowly. Certainly not many women running solo call on a level 1 floor. It wasn't quite a question. It was a man checking his own math out loud, the way surgeons do when they're narrowing a diagnosis. And I understood, in that exact second, that whatever happened next at that table was no longer something Grant or his mother could steer. It belonged to me now, the same way every decision in a trauma bay eventually does. Dr. Voss turned his phone toward the table, angled just enough that I could see it before anyone else could. A hospital directory page, my headshot, in the corner. The words Claire Whitfield, MD. Trauma and Acute Care Surgery, sitting under it in plain black font. He'd found it in under 30 seconds. That's the thing about men who spend their career imaging scans for a living. They don't guess, they confirm. Grant, he said, without looking up from the screen. Did you know this? Welcome back, if you're just joining. If you've ever watched someone you love get caught in a lie they told about you, and felt strangely calm instead of vindicated, stick around, because that calm is exactly where this story lives for the next few minutes. Drop a like if you already know the arithmetic I'm talking about. Grant's jaw worked before any words came out. Yeah, obviously I knew what Claire does. I didn't think tonight was the night to get into all the technical stuff. Dad gets weird about. About what? Dr. Voss said flat. Not a question anymore. Grant didn't answer. Deborah reached for her wine glass and found it empty, which seemed to surprise her more than anything else happening at that table. Paige, the bride, was staring at me now with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between fascination and secondhand embarrassment for her own brother. I want to be honest with you about something. In that silence while Grant scrambled for a sentence that wouldn't make things worse, I wasn't thinking about revenge. Revenge came later, and it came cold, and it came with paperwork. In that moment, at that table, I was doing something much simpler. I was doing the arithmetic. Here's what the arithmetic actually looked like, laid out plain, the way I'd eventually lay it out on a spreadsheet at 2 a.m. 3 weeks later. Grant and I had been together 2 years. In that time, I'd covered 11 of his family's dinners, birthdays, and holiday gatherings on his credit card, because his was maxed out from a car he'd financed to impress his father. I'd paid the deposit on our apartment, because my credit scored her underwriting in 4 days, and his took 3 weeks of explaining. I'd driven 6 hours round trip, twice, to sit with his grandmother in hospice, because Grant said he couldn't handle hospitals, conveniently forgetting that I handled dying people for a living, and had simply never been given the choice to say no. I'd rescheduled 2 vacation days, unpaid, because Grant's mother needed family support during a kitchen renovation that turned out to mean holding paint swatches up to a wall for 4 hours. None of that had ever been asked of me directly. That's the part people don't understand until it happens to them. Nobody sits you down and says, "Be my unpaid logistics department." They just let you become it. One small favor at a time, until one day you look up and realize you're not a partner in the relationship anymore. You're infrastructure. You're the thing that holds the walls up, while everyone else gets to be the wallpaper. If any of that sounds familiar, if you've ever realized you were the load-bearing wall in your own family or relationship, and nobody ever said thank you, comment the word infrastructure below, because I want to know how many of you are sitting in that exact same silence right now. Back at the table, Dr. Voss set his phone down again, this time face up, the hospital directory page still glowing. He looked at his son the way I imagine. He looked at a resident who'd botched a chart, not with rage, with something colder and more permanent, disappointment that had already made up its mind. 2 years, he said. 2 years you've been telling this family. She works with patients, like she cleans bedpans. He turned to me. I apologize, Dr. Whitfield. I don't know what my son was thinking, but I promise you, I do. I hadn't corrected him with my title. He'd used it on his own, and something about hearing it from a man who'd spent 30 years training surgeons landed different than if I'd said it myself. Deborah opened her mouth to smooth things over. She was good at smoothing. It was practically her love language. But her voice came out thin. We just didn't want dinner to turn into competing resumes, that's all. Richard can be, don't, Dr. Voss said, not loud. Just final. I didn't say much else that night. I let the silence do the work. Silence is good at. I ate my dinner. I answered 2 questions. Dr. Voss asked me directly about my fellowship, gave short, factual answers, and watched Grant's face get paler with every syllable I spoke. Like each true sentence was a receipt he was going to have to pay later. Here's what I want you to understand about the next 3 weeks, because this is where the real story starts. Not at that table, but in the quiet after it. I didn't confront Grant that night in the car. I didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't give him the satisfaction of a scene he could later describe as she overreacted. I drove us back to the hotel in silence, and somewhere around exit 94 on I-95, I made a decision that had nothing to do with anger. and everything to do with clarity. I was going to stop being infrastructure, and before I walked away for good, I was going to make sure Grant's family understood, in numbers they couldn't argue with, exactly what they'd been standing on for 2 years. I started small. That week back in Charleston, between 2 trauma call shifts, I opened a folder on my laptop I hadn't touched in months. My financial planner had set it up during our engagement, back when I still believed we were building something together. Joint expenses, shared apartment costs, the spreadsheet I'd built without realizing what it would eventually become. Every payment, every deposit, every just this once that had turned into a pattern. I pulled up 11 months of Venmo transfers, 6 months of shared credit card statements, and the lease agreement with my name listed as primary tenant because Grant's credit hadn't cleared. I printed screenshots of 3 separate group texts where Deborah had asked me, specifically me, never Grant, to help out with catering deposits for Paige's wedding. Texts where she'd written things like, "You're so good with this kind of thing." A compliment that had cost me $4,000 over 5 months and had never once been paid back. I laid it all out on my kitchen counter one night. After a 12-hour shift, still in scrubs, too tired to feel anything but strangely awake. Not to show anyone yet, just to see it. Just to finally look at the shape of what I'd been carrying, spread out in black and white, instead of buried under 2 years of small, reasonable-sounding requests. If you've ever done this, pulled every receipt of your own generosity out into the light, just to prove to yourself. You weren't imagining it. You already know what comes next isn't about punishing anyone. It's about finally believing your own memory. And once I believed it, I couldn't unsee it, and I wasn't interested in staying quiet about it anymore. The kitchen smelled like burnt coffee. I'd forgotten on the warmer hours earlier. My scrub top still had a faint rust-colored stain on the cuff from a chest tubes I'd placed that afternoon. And I remember looking down at it while I sorted through bank statements and thinking, this is what my hands actually do. They hold pressure on wounds that would kill someone in 4 minutes without me. And somehow I'd spent 2 years letting a room full of people decide that wasn't impressive enough to be spoken aloud at dinner. I called my younger sister Dana around midnight because she's the only person who's ever told me the truth even when I didn't want it. I read her the numbers over the phone. The $4,000 for the catering deposit, the $1,100 for Grant's cousin's bachelor weekend, that Grant had promised to get me back for. And never did. The $600 a month difference between what I put into our shared account and what Grant did, going back 14 months. Dana was quiet for a long moment. Then she said the sentence that stuck with me more than anything. Dr. Voss said at that table, "Claire, you didn't fall in love with a partner. You fell in love with a job you never got paid for." I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was angry. I want to be clear. The anger came later, quieter, and more useful than the raw version of it. I stayed up because for the first time in 2 years, I was finally looking directly at something I'd spent a very long time not looking at. And once you see a pattern laid out in dates and dollar amounts, you can't talk yourself back into the fog. The fog only survives in vague memory. It doesn't survive a spreadsheet. By 3 a.m., I had a folder. Not a plan yet, just a folder, labeled plainly, without drama, the way I'd label a chart. Documentation. Inside it, screenshots, bank transfers, 3 photos of handwritten notes Deborah had left on my apartment door, asking for just a small favor, each one attached to a dollar amount I'd quietly absorbed without ever being asked twice. I didn't know yet exactly what I was going to do with it, but I knew I wasn't going to be the only one in that family who understood the truth of what I'd built alone. In a relationship, everyone else assumed was equal. If you've ever spent a sleepless night finally naming something you'd been calling just how things are, tell me where you're watching from, because I have a feeling a lot of you already know exactly where this story is headed next. The breaking point didn't come with yelling. I want to tell you that up front, because if you're expecting a screaming match, a thrown plate, some cinematic blow-up, that's not how it happens for people like me. People who've spent years learning to stay steady while someone's femoral artery is open on a table don't lose composure over a phone call. The breaking point came on a Tuesday at 6:47 p.m. while I was still in the parking garage at Charleston Regional, sitting in my car with the engine off, staring at a text message from Grant that read, "Hey babe. Wedding planner needs the final catering deposit by Friday. Can you send it? And I'll Venmo you back this time. Promise, love you." This time. As if there had been a first time he'd already made good on. As if the folder sitting open on my laptop at home, 3 weeks deep now, didn't already prove there hadn't been. Welcome back to Quiet Storm Family Stories. If you've ever gotten one more request from someone who's never once paid you back, and felt something in you go completely, permanently still, this chapter is for you. Stay to the end, because this is where I stopped asking to be understood and started building something they couldn't argue with. I sat in that parking garage for 11 minutes without moving. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the clock on my dashboard the entire time. The way you watch vitals on a monitor when you're waiting to see if a patient stabilizes or crashes. I wasn't crying. I want to be clear about that. I'd cried plenty over the 2 years, quietly, in the shower, in my car after difficult shifts, never in front of Grant, because some part of me had already learned that my tears made him uncomfortable in a way my competence never did. But that night, in the garage, there were no tears left to spend. There was just a very quiet, very clear thought that arrived the way a diagnosis arrives, once you've ruled out everything else. This isn't a relationship. This is a maintenance contract, and I'm the only one honoring it. I didn't reply to the text right away. I drove home, changed out of my scrubs, made myself dinner. I didn't really taste, and sat down at my kitchen table with the folder. 3 weeks of documentation had turned it from a handful of screenshots into something closer to a case file. The kind I'd have handed to a resident and said, "Tell me what this pattern shows you." So I did exactly that. I made myself read it as if I were a stranger, as if Claire Whitfield were a patient, and I needed to diagnose what had actually been happening to her for 2 years. Here's what the file showed, cold and complete. 14 months of shared expenses, where I'd covered 68% of joint costs on a relationship that was supposed to be split evenly. $4,100 in wedding-related expenses for Paige's wedding. A wedding that wasn't even mine, quietly absorbed because you're so good with this kind of thing. 11 family events where I was expected to attend, contribute, and perform gratitude for the privilege, while Grant's contributions to my life, my family, my career, amounted to exactly 0 documented instances of reciprocity, and underneath all of it, the sentence that had started this whole story. She works with patients. If you've ever done the math on your own relationship and realized the numbers only ever flowed one direction, drop a comment with the word ledger, because that's exactly what this had become for me. Not a partnership, a ledger, and I was the only one keeping it balanced. I want to talk about what infrastructure, not family, actually means, because it took me 2 years and 1 spreadsheet to understand it fully. Infrastructure doesn't get invited to conversations. It gets used. Nobody consults the load-bearing wall about renovation plans. Nobody says thank you to the wiring for keeping the lights on. Infrastructure is just expected to function silently, indefinitely, without complaint. And the moment it asks for maintenance of its own, everyone acts shocked that it needed anything at all. That's what I'd become to Grant's family. Not a daughter-in-law, not even really a partner. I was the thing that made their lives run smoothly enough that nobody had to examine how much smoothness cost or who was paying for it. And the dinner in Savannah hadn't been an isolated incident of Grant being embarrassed by my job. It had been the clearest possible window into a truth I'd been avoiding for 2 years. They didn't want to know who I actually was, because knowing would have required acknowledging what I'd been giving them, and gratitude was a debt none of them wanted to carry. I picked up my phone. I didn't reply to Grant's text about the catering deposit. Instead, I opened my banking app and did something I'd never done in 2 years together. I checked, screenshot by screenshot, every single transfer I'd made toward anything connected to his family since the day we got engaged. $14,200. I stared at that number for a long time. $14,000 was almost exactly what I'd paid toward my own student loans that year. It was more than I'd spent on myself, on anything, in 18 months combined. If you're doing your own math right now while you're watching this, pause the video. Actually go check. I promise you, most people underestimate the real number by half. I texted Grant back a single line. I'm not sending the deposit. We need to talk when I'm off shift Thursday. 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. He called 4 times over the next hour. I let all 4 calls go to voicemail. Not out of spite. I simply didn't have anything left to say that a phone call at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday could hold. Some conversations need a room, a table, and enough silence beforehand that both people finally have to sit in the truth, instead of talking past it. Thursday came. Grant showed up at my apartment with flowers, which told me everything about how little he understood what was actually happening. Flowers are for an argument. This wasn't an argument. I let him in, sat him down at the same kitchen table, where the folders still sat closed but visible, and I told him calmly, the way I deliver bad news to families in a quiet room off the trauma bay, exactly what I'd realized. I'm not upset that your dad didn't know what I do, I said. I'm upset that you built 2 years of my life around, making sure he never had to. Grant opened his mouth to explain, the way he always did, but I kept going, because for the first time, I wasn't interested in leaving room for his explanation to reshape the facts. You've cost me $14,000. I never asked to spend, and every single time, you made it feel like generosity instead of what it actually was. A pattern. And I'm done pretending I didn't notice. He didn't deny the number. That told me more than any apology could have. He sat there, flowers still in his lap, and for the first time in 2 years, I watched him understand that the version of me he'd built his comfort around, quiet, accommodating, endlessly patient, wasn't a permanent feature. It had just been the version of me that hadn't finished doing the math yet. If you've ever watched someone realize, in real time, that the person they'd taken for granted had finally stopped granting, that's the exact moment I'm describing right now. And it is one of the quietest, most powerful moments I've ever lived through. I didn't raise my voice once. I didn't need to. The folder did the talking. And folders don't lie, and folders don't backpedal, and folders don't ask to be forgiven for being honest. I told Grant I needed space. Not dramatically, not as a threat, as a simple, clinical fact, the way I'd tell a patient's family that the next 72 hours would determine the outcome. I needed time away from the wedding, away from his family's group texts, away from being anyone's unpaid coordinator, to figure out whether there was anything left, underneath the arithmetic, worth saving. He left that night without the flowers. I never did find out what he did with them. What I did that weekend instead was call Dana, book a flight, and start putting together something I hadn't planned. 3 weeks earlier at that rehearsal dinner. A way to make sure Grant's family understood, once and for all, in terms even Dr. Richard Voss couldn't argue with, exactly what they'd built their comfort on top of. Comment below if you think I went too far, because what happens next is the part people either love me for or can't stop arguing about in the replies. Paige's wedding was 6 weeks away when I made my decision, and I want to be honest with you about what that decision actually was, because it wasn't revenge in the way people usually mean it. I wasn't going to burn the venue down or show up in a red dress and ruin someone's photos. I'm a surgeon. My whole career is built on precision, knowing exactly where to cut, exactly how deep, exactly what to leave untouched. So that's what I did. I planned one conversation with one piece of evidence, delivered to exactly the right person, at exactly the right moment. Welcome back to Shadow Drama Stories. And if you've made it this far, thank you for staying with me, because this is the part of the story I've been building towards since that first dinner in Savannah. Drop a comment if you're ready for the reveal, because it's not what most people expect. Grant and I hadn't fully broken up in those 6 weeks. We were somewhere in between, not together, not finished, both of us circling a truth neither of us had said out loud yet. He'd tried, twice, to bring up the wedding, tried to smooth things over the way his mother always smoothed things over, with vague apologies that never once mentioned a specific number or a specific fix. I let him talk. I'd learned by then that people who won't name the actual harm they caused are usually the same people who have no intention of actually repairing it. 2 weeks before the wedding, Dr. Voss called me directly. Not through Grant. Directly, my number saved from that night in Savannah. He asked if I'd be willing to have coffee with him the next time I was near Houston for a conference. I almost said no. Then I thought about the folder sitting on my laptop, and I said yes, because some conversations deserve a room and a table, not a phone call. We met at a quiet coffee shop near the medical center, the kind of place surgeons go when they don't want to be recognized. He ordered black coffee. I did too. He didn't waste time on small talk, which I respected immediately. I want to understand what happened in my family, he said. Not the surface version, the real one. So I told him. Not with anger. I'd used all my anger up weeks earlier, alone, at that kitchen table. I told him with the same flat clarity I use when I explain a diagnosis to a family who needs facts, not comfort. I opened my laptop and showed him the folder, not to humiliate his son. I want to be clear about that, because this is the part some viewers get wrong when they hear this story. Secondhand, I showed him because he'd asked for the truth, and the truth had a paper trail. $14,200 in documented transfers. Screenshots of texts asking me, specifically me, for money, for favors, for my time, always phrased as if I were doing something optional instead of something expected. The lease with only my name on it. 11 family events attended. 0 reciprocated. If you've ever had to prove something you already knew was true, just to be believed, comment the word receipts. Because that's exactly what this moment was for me. Not about winning an argument. About finally having something concrete enough that nobody could tell me I was overreacting. Dr. Voss read through it slowly. The same way he'd checked my credentials that first night. Thorough, methodical, unwilling to react until he'd confirmed every data point. When he finished, he closed the laptop gently and sat back in his chair. I built a career, he said, teaching residents that competence without character is dangerous. I never once thought to check whether I'd raised a son with both. He apologized to me directly, not for his son's behavior specifically, but for the culture of his own family, the unspoken rule that whoever complained the least got trusted the most, and whoever gave the most got asked for more. He asked what I wanted to do. I told him the truth. I didn't want restitution. I didn't want an apology tour at the wedding. I wanted Grant to understand without me having to explain it to him. One more time, that love isn't measured in what someone lets you get away with. It's measured in what they refuse to let slide, because they think you're capable of better. 2 days later, Grant called me. Dr. Voss had shown him the folder. Not to shame him publicly, but privately, father to son. The way accountability is supposed to work when it's done right. Grant's voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Not defensive. Just quiet. I didn't think I was doing anything wrong, he said. I thought that's just what love looked like. Somebody handling things so I didn't have to. And there it was. The sentence that explained 2 years in 9 words. He hadn't been cruel. He'd just never been asked to notice what convenience cost someone else. I told him I appreciated him finally saying that out loud. And then I told him something I'd been carrying since that night in the parking garage. I wasn't coming to the wedding as his fiancé. I still cared about him. I might always care about him. But I wasn't willing to spend 1 more year being someone's infrastructure and calling it partnership. If he wanted to build something real with me, it would have to start from 0. No folders, no ledgers, no quiet resentment stacking up behind a smile, equal or not at all. If you're wondering whether we got back together, stay with me, because the answer surprised even me. We didn't, not because the conversation went badly. It didn't. It went about as well as any conversation like that can go. But somewhere in those 6 weeks of documenting, of finally naming what had been happening, I realized something that mattered more than whether Grant and I survived. I realized that the version of me who kept quiet at that dinner table, who covered deposits without being asked twice, who let "she works with patience" go unchallenged for 2 years. That version of me had been quietly disappearing a little more every month, and I wanted her back more than I wanted the wedding. Here's the lesson underneath all of it, and I don't say this to sound like a greeting card. I say it because it took me 2 years and 1 folder full of receipts to actually learn it. Being needed isn't the same as being valued. A family, a partner, a workplace, any relationship can lean on you completely and still never once ask who you actually are underneath what you provide. The people who love you right don't just accept your competence. They brag about it. They correct the room when someone gets it wrong. They don't need a folder of evidence to already know your worth, because they were paying attention the whole time. If you have to build a case file to prove you matter to the people closest to you, that's not a communication problem. That's already your answer. I went to Paige's wedding anyway, 6 weeks later, not as Grant's fiancé, but as a guest, at Dr. Voss's personal invitation. Deborah barely spoke to me, which told me everything I needed to know about who in that family had actually changed and who had simply lost access to a convenient arrangement. Grant and I were polite, distant, the way two people are, when they both know something ended honestly instead of bitterly. Dr. Voss found me by the bar near the end of the night, shook my hand the same firm way he had that first night, and said, "For what it's worth, Dr. Whitfield, any hospital in this country would be lucky to have you walk through their doors. I hope the next family who gets to know you actually deserves you." I drove back to Charleston that weekend with the windows down, no folder in the passenger seat, no ledger running in the back of my mind. Just the quiet certainty that I'd stopped being anyone's infrastructure and started, finally, being fully and unapologetically myself again. That's my story. If you've ever been reduced to something smaller than you are, by people who should have known better, your worth was never up for negotiation, and neither is mine. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe. Drop a comment telling me which chapter hit hardest, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. This is Shadow Drama Stories, and I'll see you in the next one.